The morning came quietly, almost deceptively, with the first tremors of light creeping across the endless grasslands. The sun rose not in triumph, but in hesitation, spilling pale gold onto the earth as if reluctant to illuminate what was about to unfold. The air was heavy with the dry scent of summer dust, stirred by the hooves of restless horses tethered to picket lines. Saddles groaned, bridles jingled faintly, and somewhere in the camp a young man coughed into his sleeve, the sound brittle and uncertain, lost in the vast silence of the Dakota plains. The world seemed to hold its breath, yet the land itself knew. The land always knew. It carried memory in the wind, memory in the soil, memory in the broken treaties and abandoned promises that lay beneath every footprint. This was not the beginning of something. It was the end, crouching low, waiting for the right moment to rise. Among the men of the 7th Cavalry, there was no laughter that morning. Not even the careless talk of soldiers trying to stave off fear with crude jokes or boasting. Instead, there were only the sounds of routine. Boots pulled tight, rifles checked and rechecked, powder horns rattling faintly. The faint rasp of pen against paper could be heard in a corner of the camp, where one private bent over a scrap of stationery, scratching hurried words by the light of a guttering lantern. The ink bled into the page, but his hand did not falter. He wrote to his mother, though he knew the letter might never find her hands. He wrote because it was all that tethered him to the world beyond this valley. Nearby, another soldier fingered a rosary hidden beneath his jacket, lips moving silently. Others carried no tokens, no charms, only the empty weight of duty pressing against their ribs. Each man carried something invisible, the face of a child, the sound of a wife's voice, the half-remembered smell of a home kitchen. Yet none of it would matter soon. Dust was already rising from the earth, curling around them like a shroud. Across the river, the encampment of the Lakota and Cheyenne stirred with its own morning sounds. Smoke drifted from fires, carrying the scent of broth and roasted meat. Women's hands worked quickly, tightening cradle boards, folding hides, braiding hair with steady precision. Children chased each other along the grass, their laughter thin and bright against the gathering storm. In the lodges, elders prayed, their voices low and rhythmic, asking the spirits for strength, for vision, for protection. The warriors sharpened blades, checked rifles, painted their faces with symbols that turned flesh into prophecy. These were not just warriors. They were guardians of a way of life under siege, keepers of land and sky, protectors of the right to exist without chains. They knew what the soldiers across the river did not, that this was not a skirmish, not an act of conquest. This was survival, sharpened into a single moment. And so the earth held both camps, balanced on the edge of catastrophe. One army marched under the banner of empire, blind to its own frailty. The other rose in defense of memory, carrying songs that had survived generations, ready to clash against rifles and sabers. Between them lay the river, glinting like a blade under the morning sun, whispering of division, of inevitability, of blood. The sky seemed to bend lower, pressing its weight onto the shoulders of every soul who stood on that soil. Even the animals felt it, the horses restless, ears flicking, eyes wide with unease. A lone crow drifted above the valley, circling in silence, black wings cutting against the brightening sky. It watched as if bearing witness, as if it had seen this before, as if it knew that the earth was about to be scarred once more. The soldiers shifted uneasily in their saddles. Some tried to mask their fear with rigid posture. Others let it seep into every glance, every tightened grip on the reins. They could feel it, even if they would not name it, the sense that history itself was pressing down on them, that they were not riding toward glory, but toward erasure. In the encampment, the warriors gathered. They did not speak loudly. Their silence was heavier than words. They painted their shields, sang under their breath, braided their hair tighter. Mothers pressed their lips against the foreheads of children. Old men raised their faces to the sky, reading the shape of clouds as if they were scripture. The air itself vibrated with anticipation, like a bowstring drawn back, quivering, waiting for release. And still the crow watched. For history would remember the name of Custer, spoken in tones of legend and defeat, but it would not keep the names of the privates who wrote letters by lantern light, nor the women who whispered prayers over sleeping children, nor the warriors who carried centuries of memory into battle. These were the forgotten, the lives swept into dust, swallowed by the roar of gunfire and the heavy silence that followed. The moment stretched, unbearably fragile. Dust curled higher in the air, wrapping itself around boots and hooves, blurring faces, filling mouths with the taste of earth. The valley seemed to tremble, not from cannon or musket, but from the weight of what was about to break. And then came the cry, the harsh, sharp call of the crow splitting the morning silence. It echoed across the valley like a signal, like a warning, like a prophecy fulfilled. Every heart stilled. Every hand tightened. The air thickened, charged with a storm too vast to contain. The soldiers shifted, rifles raised, eyes narrowing across the river. The warriors bent low, ready to surge, ready to defend. The women and children pulled closer to the fires, their prayers rising like smoke into the morning sky. The world exhaled, at last, and the curtain of history began to fall. The dust that rose at dawn was no longer the dust of mourning, but the dust of battle, the dust of bodies, the dust of memory collapsing into legend. It swirled in the air like a veil, hiding faces, blurring truth, swallowing the cries of the dying and the voices of the forgotten. And as it rose higher, blotting out the clear summer sky, it carried with it the weight of a turning point. This valley, once only grass and water, would never again be innocent. The names would fade, the songs would fracture, the bones would sink into earth. Yet the dust remained, carrying whispers of lives that the world chose not to remember. And so the story moves forward, deeper into the storm, where courage and desperation collide, where silence is broken by gunfire, where the forgotten meet their fate beneath the watchful eyes of the crow. The silence shattered not with a shout, nor with the first shot of powder, but with a sound older than either camp, the drumbeat beneath the soil. It was not made by hands, nor carved from hide and wood, but by hooves striking earth, by the thunder of horses restless with fear. The ground itself trembled, as if remembering every war that had scarred it before, carrying their echoes forward into this hour. The soldiers felt it first in their boots, the faint vibration rising through leather soles, rattling through bones. Their mounts stamped uneasily, ears twitching, nostrils wide, breathing the scent of grass mixed with the sharper tang of smoke and iron. Men tightened reins, muttered curses, whispered prayers. They were not yet under fire, but already their stomachs clenched, their mouths dry. This was no longer a march. It was an approach into something vast, something unseen, something they could not master. Across the river, in the heart of the encampment, the same tremor carried. But here, the sound was not dread, it was rhythm. It merged with voices rising, soft at first, then stronger, as the Lakota and Cheyenne sang their songs of defense. The cadence was steady, ancient, threading together generations who had fought to survive the endless advance of empire. Warriors painted their faces, red streaks across cheek and brow, black circles around eyes sharpened into fire. Feathers caught in their braids stirred in the morning wind. Rifles were checked, arrows bundled, knives bound tight at the waist. They moved with a calm born not of arrogance, but of necessity. This was their land, their rivers. Their children's laughter still echoed among the lodges. They would not surrender them easily. For the soldiers, the air smelled of iron filings and leather, sweat soaked into wool. For the families in the encampment, the air was laced with sage, with smoke from fires where pots of broth simmered in hurried preparation. The same sun burned above them both, the same earth trembled beneath their feet. Yet one side rode into uncertainty, while the other stood grounded in the certainty of loss, whether of life or of the right to remain free. Custer rode at the center, golden hair gleaming, eyes fixed forward. To his men he appeared resolute, a figure untouchable. But shadows lay hidden in his determination. Scouts had warned him of the numbers, of the danger of pressing forward into the valley. He had dismissed them, convinced that audacity alone would split his enemies apart. Yet the tremor in the earth betrayed him. He could not see what waited beyond the ridge, but the land itself seemed to whisper against him. Still, he rode on, drawn by a vision of glory that was already beginning to crumble. The first voices rose higher now, war songs carrying across the grass. They cut through the morning air with a sound that was not merely human. It was elemental, fierce as wind, steady as the river's flow. Soldiers stiffened at the sound, their breath catching. To their ears, it was not song, but omen, and the drumbeat beneath the soil seemed to grow louder, answering the voices as though the earth itself was keeping time. Somewhere among the cavalry, a boy no older than 19 tightened his grip on the rifle stock he had carved initials into. His lips moved around the name of a brother left behind in Kentucky, a name he had repeated like a prayer since the march began. Another man brushed his fingers over a pouch at his belt, inside of which lay a lock of hair from his daughter's first braid. Each man carried a talisman of memory, though none could shield them from the storm about to break. In the encampment, mothers drew their children close, eyes fierce though their hands trembled. Elders placed palms against the ground, feeling the tremors rise as if they could read the story before it was written. "It comes," one whispered, voice hoarse, face creased with years of sorrow. And then it did. The silence broke apart in thunder. A line of cavalry advanced, sabers catching the sun in a sudden flash that seared the eyes. Horses surged forward, nostrils flaring, hooves ripping the earth. The first crack of gunfire split the air, smoke unfurling into the sky like a torn veil. Arrows answered, whistling sharp and swift, cutting through leather, flesh, bone. Screams rose. Short, startled, human. The valley became a storm of sound and motion. Gunpowder choked the lungs. Dust turned the air thick, blinding. The clash of steel and the cries of the wounded blurred into a single roar, one that seemed to have no end, only a deepening pitch. Yet beneath it all, beneath the gunfire and shouting, the earth's drumbeat continued. Hooves striking, hearts pounding, the ancient rhythm of survival. Men fell quickly, swallowed by dust, their names already fading as the next volley tore through the air. A horse stumbled, throwing its rider hard into the ground. The boy with the initials carved into his rifle screamed his brother's name as he fired blindly into the haze. In the camp, warriors surged forward with cries that rose like thunder, voices woven into the rhythm of drums unseen. Their shadows stretched long in the smoke, fierce, unyielding, carrying memory forward in every strike. The battle had begun, and the valley was no longer a place of grass and river. It had become an altar, and the offering was blood. Still the crow circled overhead, wings spread wide, its cry swallowed by the storm. To some it was only a bird, to others it was the spirit of prophecy, watching, recording, bearing witness. It did not choose sides. It saw only the dust, the fire, the breaking of men, the shattering of illusions. As the morning stretched into chaos, the rhythm beneath the earth did not falter. Each heartbeat, each hoofbeat, each cry of life or death merged into the same inexorable song. And for those who could feel it, it was not only the song of battle, but the song of history itself, reminding them that the earth always remembers, even when names and faces are lost. The drums beneath the earth carried the story forward, into deeper fire, into sharper loss. What began as silence had become thunder, and what thundered now would soon collapse into stillness again. A stillness heavier than any silence before. But that stillness had not yet come. The battle raged on. High above the choking dust, beyond the reach of gunfire and smoke, a crow drifted on slow, patient wings. Its feathers glinted black against the pale sky, a dark flame carried by the wind. Below it stretched a valley transformed. Where once there had been grass and laughter, there was now the clash of men, the roar of rifles, the piercing whistle of arrows. Yet the bird did not flee. It circled, watching, silent, its eye reflecting both camps, both destinies, both the living and the dying. From its height, the crow saw the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry stumble forward, their rigid lines broken by the sudden surge of warriors. The blue of their uniforms was already smeared with dust and blood, their banners tangled, their shouts drowned beneath the storm. Horses reared, neighing in terror, eyes white with fear, as riders tried desperately to hold formation. The air carried the acrid sting of powder, the sharp tang of sweat and leather, the sour smell of fear clinging to every breath. On the other side, the crow saw the Lakota and Cheyenne descend like a river breaking free of its banks. Their painted faces shone through the haze, symbols of thunder, of night, of the earth itself marked across flesh. They moved with a fluid grace that belied the violence, each step bound to the song still echoing in their throats. The warriors surged not as scattered individuals, but as a force tied together by memory, by necessity, by the knowledge that their families watched from the lodges behind them. Their cries cut through the smoke, raw and unbroken, carrying both fury and grief. The crow wheeled again, its wings slicing against the wind, and below it, the battle grew more desperate. A boy soldier fell to his knees, clutching his chest where an arrow had struck deep. His mouth opened, not in words but in a voiceless cry, his rifle slipping from bloodied hands. Another soldier, older, staggered toward him, reaching, but was cut down by a mounted warrior whose horse thundered past in a spray of dust. Their bodies collapsed into the earth together, nameless, faceless, already claimed by the soil. In the camp beyond, mothers held their children close, listening to the sounds of the fight drift toward them like a storm rolling nearer. They did not scream. They prayed, pressing their palms against the small backs of their sons and daughters, whispering words of strength into their ears. Some women took up knives, not as weapons for attack, but as a promise that they would not leave their children helpless should the lines break. The crow saw their resolve too, silent and unyielding. The soldiers tried to push forward, to seize the initiative, to wrestle order from the chaos. But the earth did not yield to them. For every volley fired, another wave of warriors surged in answer, arrows flashing, rifles cracking, spears darting through the dust. The valley became a whirl of shadows, blue coats and painted faces, sabers and shields, bodies falling into the same dust that rose to hide them. The crow cawed once, sharp and piercing, the sound cutting through the haze. It echoed across the plains, a cry that seemed to belong neither to bird nor beast, but to the land itself. Men heard it faintly through the roar, and some shuddered, though they did not know why. It was as though the battle had a witness, something older, something impartial, something that remembered all things and judged nothing. A sergeant shouted hoarsely, rallying his men, his voice cracking with smoke. His command barely carried, drowned by the thunder of hooves. Yet for a moment, his soldiers formed around him, rifles raised, faces grim. They fired into the advancing line, smoke spitting from their barrels, ears ringing with the blast. Warriors fell, but the line did not break. The crow saw them rise again, saw others take their place, saw the fury and grief in their eyes as they surged forward with renewed force. The crow's wings beat against the sky as it wheeled lower, circling above the ridge. From here, the chaos blurred into one massive movement, shadows grappling, dust rising, flashes of steel, the red of blood. The land itself seemed to shift beneath the weight of so many bodies, as though the earth was weary of bearing the struggle. And yet, in the midst of that chaos, the crow saw the forgotten. A private sprawled in the grass, clutching a letter crumpled in his hand, its ink smeared with blood. A warrior kneeling beside the fallen body of a friend, his hand pressed briefly to the earth before he rose again, eyes burning with vengeance. A woman standing at the edge of the lodges, her face streaked with ash, singing softly as the battle raged. These moments, small and fleeting, were as much the story as any charge or retreat. The bird's shadow crossed over Custer himself, golden hair glinting in the haze. His face was taut, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the fight. He urged his men forward with sharp commands, but the battle was already slipping beyond his grasp. The crow circled above him, silent, as though measuring the weight of the man against the weight of history. Below, the cries rose louder. The valley was no longer a place of grass and river, but of fire and thunder. Smoke coiled upward, veiling the sun, turning day into dusk. The crow rose higher, wings spread wide, watching as the valley became a crucible where arrogance and survival clashed, where names would be lost, where memory would fracture. It circled once more, and in its cry, there was no triumph. No sorrow, only the cold witness of time. For what it saw would not end here. This moment, though drenched in blood and dust, was only one echo in a larger storm, the collision of worlds, the breaking of promises, the endless cycle of conquest and resistance. The crow turned its wings toward the horizon, leaving behind the valley that would soon be filled with silence. Below it, men screamed, dust rose, horses fell, and the earth drank deeply. Yet above it all, the crow carried the memory onward, a black flame drifting into the vastness of sky. And the story pressed forward still, into the deepening fury, into the collapse of lines, into the final stand where glory would be swallowed by dust. Among the bodies that pressed into the dust, among the cries and thunder of hooves, there were words that would never be spoken, thoughts that would never find paper. Yet scattered across the field, crumpled in pockets and pouches, were the letters already written. Letters to wives, to mothers, to children too young to read them. Letters filled with tenderness, fear, and half-formed promises. The crow had flown beyond, but the valley still clutched these fragile pages. One private, face pale and lips cracked from thirst, drew a folded scrap from his coat as he sank behind a fallen horse. His hand shook, not from battle but from memory. He whispered a line barely audible through the roar. "Tell them. I tried." The ink had smeared with sweat. The paper softened from his touch. He held it once more, then closed his eyes as the dust swallowed him. Another, a boy scarcely 18, had tucked a note into the lining of his boot. The words were brief, awkward, written in the shaky hand of one who had never thought much about death until now. "I will return in glory. Do not worry." Now the boot lay twisted in the mud, its promise broken, the letter sealed forever in silence. These letters, unsent, unspoken, carried the weight of what it meant to be human in the face of war. They were not strategies, not commands, not declarations of empire. They were fragments of love, fragments of fear, fragments of dreams that had no place on the battlefield. And yet across the valley, the Lakota and Cheyenne too carried words left unsaid. There were prayers whispered in the wind, songs left unfinished, messages spoken into the ears of children the night before. Stay strong. Remember who you are. Remember the earth is older than their guns. These were not written on paper but carried in voices, in memory, in the rhythm of drums that no bullet could erase. Still, the letters of the cavalry lay in the dirt, fragile as autumn leaves. A sergeant clutched his as he fell, his blood staining the fold. His letter had been meant for a daughter waiting far away in a wooden house where the fields stretched calm and silent. He had written of the horizon, of the hope of land, of a return that now could never come. His last breath escaped against the paper, as though trying to give his words one final chance to reach her. The smoke thickened, the rifles cracked, and the letters disappeared into the chaos. Some burned in the fire of camp wagons overturned. Others dissolved in mud, their ink bleeding into the ground, mingling with the blood of their writers. The words became indistinguishable, one from another, until all that remained was a blurred memory pressed into the soil. But the silence of those letters spoke louder than the gunfire. They told of men who had thought themselves unbreakable, now brought low, not by weakness, but by the inevitability of the earth reclaiming them. They told of loves that would not be answered, of children who would never understand why the chair at the table remained empty. And in that silence, there was a strange symmetry. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, too, carried losses unspoken. Brothers who would not return, fathers who would be buried beneath the grass they had defended, voices that would fade from the circle of the lodge. Their words were not written in ink but carried in song, in the cry of the drum, in the trembling breath of those who waited in the lodges, listening for the return of footsteps that might never come. The battle raged on, but beneath it, the ground itself seemed to hum with the weight of all those unwritten stories. Each body that fell pressed a new silence into the soil. Each letter left unsent became another ghost wandering the valley. A young officer, his hands trembling, tried to scrawl a final line on the back of an envelope as the circle of warriors closed in around him. The pencil broke, the line unfinished, the words forever incomplete. He pressed the half-written note to his chest as though the act itself might carry it home. It did not. The valley was not only a grave of men, but a grave of words, of voices cut short. The smoke drifted upward, carrying with it prayers and curses alike, carrying the fragments of what had been meant to be remembered. And the crow, somewhere on the horizon, carried those fragments too, unseen, unheard, yet eternal. What remained was not glory. It was the ache of absence. The letters never sent were a testament not to victory or defeat, but to the cost of both. They were the shadows of lives interrupted, the echoes of promises too fragile to withstand the storm. And as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the valley of dust and blood, the silence of those letters grew heavier. For the battle had not yet ended. The circle was tightening. The cries of warriors grew louder. The soldiers clung desperately to what remained of their lines, but the earth had already claimed their voices. the crow would return, circling once more over the field where bodies lay and ink stained the grass. But for now, the wind carried only the silence of words unsent, drifting like ash into the fading sky. And beyond that silence, something darker waited. The moment when the letters would no longer matter, when men would stand not as writers or dreamers, but as the last defenders of their names. The valley pressed toward that inevitable silence. The last stand was drawing near. The letters had fallen silent. Ink dissolved into soil, words melted into the dust. What remained was not memory, but immediacy, the tightening of a circle, the weight of inevitability. The valley itself seemed to breathe, its lungs filled with smoke, its heartbeat the rhythm of hoofbeats that drew closer, closer still. Custer's men, pale with thirst, their faces streaked with blood and powder, pressed together on the hilltop. Their rifles burned in their hands, barrels too hot to grip, the last cartridges shaken from pouches already nearly empty. Some prayed beneath their breath, words spilling like broken beads, half-remembered prayers from childhood chapels. Others stared silently at the horizon, their eyes fixed not on the warriors rushing forward, but on something unseen, on home, on faces that would never know the truth of this place. Around them, the Lakota and Cheyenne tightened their circle, a living noose of horses and warriors. Painted bodies flashed in the sunlight, shields gleamed, arrows sang. From every ridge, from every fold of the earth they came, a tide that did not break, a tide that did not rest. The air shook with their cries, not chaotic but united, the voice of a people defending their earth. The soldiers fired volley after volley, smoke curling into the sky like the breath of dying men. Horses screamed and toppled, men scrambled to drag the wounded behind makeshift barricades of saddles and corpses. The circle grew smaller, the fire closed in. At the heart of the storm stood Custer himself, blonde hair matted with dust and sweat, his blue coat streaked with powder. His face was no longer the face of portraits, no longer the polished mask of parades. It was the face of a man who knew the end had come. His pistol barked in sharp defiance, but each shot was swallowed by the roar of thousands. A trooper near him cried out, clutching a wound that spread red across his shirt. He collapsed, eyes wide, mouth gasping like a fish dragged from water. Another knelt to load, hands trembling too violently to fit cartridge to chamber. The circle pressed closer still. The Lakota had spoken of this moment before the battle began, that the soldiers would be cut off, encircled, swallowed whole by the earth they sought to claim. Now the prophecy lived in fire and blood. Riders swept past, loosing arrows with precision, spears flashing, rifles cracking from the ridges. The soldiers fired wildly, desperately, each shot a final breath hurled into the storm. The sun glared down, merciless, watching as men were ground into dust. The cries of the wounded rose above the gunfire, prayers turning to screams, screams dissolving into silence. Smoke stung the eyes, blood choked the dust. The circle burned hotter, narrower. There was nowhere left to run. Some soldiers huddled together, backs pressed tight, rifles raised in defiance though their cartridges were nearly gone. They looked less like warriors now, more like boys caught in a storm too great for their small bodies to endure. One whispered, "Hold steady, boys." But his voice cracked, and steadiness was already gone. Among the Lakota, among the Cheyenne, there was no hesitation. They had seen their lands carved, their bison slaughtered, their families driven into hunger. Here at last was the moment to strike back, to carve memory into the bones of history. Every cry that tore from their throats was not just rage, it was survival, it was defiance, it was the roar of a people refusing to vanish. The circle was flame. It tightened, it devoured. A final volley cracked from the hilltop, a thin, ragged sound swallowed by the thunder that answered it. Then silence, brief, heavy, eternal. A silence in which the valley itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, the charge. Warriors surged from every side, horses leaping the barricades, spears thrusting, rifles blazing at close range. The hilltop dissolved into chaos. Screams tore the air, blades flashed, pistols fired until they clicked empty. Dust swallowed the sun, and in that storm of fire and flesh, the last defenders fell. Custer stood at the center, pistol raised until the final shot. No one knows the exact moment his voice was silenced, but the earth knows. The earth remembers the sound of his body striking dust, the way the circle closed over him like a shroud. His name would be carried far, carved into headlines, into monuments, into the mouths of those who had never set foot in this valley. But here in this place, he was only another body among many. The crow returned then, black wings cutting the sky, circling above the smoke. Below, the hilltop was a ruin of silence, broken only by the fading cries of the dying. Rifles lay twisted, sabers half buried in mud, blue coats torn and stained. The fire of battle drifted away, leaving only the echo of what had been inevitable. The circle of fire had closed, and within it, every soldier lay still. But victory was not without cost. Among the Lakota and Cheyenne, too, bodies lay across the grass, blood darkening the earth they had fought to protect. Mothers would mourn, brothers would fall silent, songs would be sung with voices trembling from grief as much as triumph. The circle had devoured both sides, leaving only memory to decide what would be remembered, what would be forgotten. The crow circled once more, then vanished beyond the horizon. The valley lay still, heavy with the weight of silence. And yet, beneath that silence, something stirred, the beginning of a story that would not end here. For history would not remember this place as the warriors knew it, nor as the soldiers had lived it. It would remember in fragments, in myths, in monuments. It would twist and reshape until the truth lay as buried as the letters never sent. But for now, the earth remembered, and the wind carried the echo of the last circle of fire, whispering it into the endless plains. When the last gunshot faded, when the last scream dissolved into the valley winds, there was only stillness. The earth itself seemed to recoil, as if weary of drinking blood. Dust hung in the air, lit by the dying sun, a golden haze that refused to settle. The grass, trampled, scorched, torn, lay flat as though pressed down by the weight of centuries. What had once been a hill of fire was now a grave of silence. The crows returned first, black wings against a sky painted in ash and crimson. They did not cry out, for there was no need. Their presence was a verdict. They circled, patient, knowing the earth had yielded more than flesh. It had yielded stories. The Lakota and Cheyenne moved among the fallen. The war cries were gone now, replaced by silence and low murmurs. Warriors searched for kin among the bodies, voices breaking as names were called into the wind, answered only by stillness. Mothers, sons lay twisted in the grass, eyes open to a sky they could no longer see. Some warriors knelt, pressing palms into the soil, whispering prayers that rose like smoke to the Great Spirit. Others gathered weapons, ammunition, and horses, spoils not of greed but of survival. In the heart of the hill lay the bodies of the 7th Cavalry. Blue coats darkened with blood, faces pale beneath the dust, hands frozen in final gestures. Some clutched rifles, some reached outward as though seeking the last touch of home. The earth had claimed them, indifferent to their rank, their ambition, their cause. Among them lay George Armstrong Custer, the man whose name would ignite newspapers, who would be polished into myth and martyrdom. Yet here, in the raw silence of the battlefield, there was no glory. His face was as still as the others, his body stripped of command. Death had equalized what pride and hierarchy had divided. The silence stretched long. It was not peace, but aftermath. The kind of silence that weighs heavier than noise, that presses into the chest until the breath stumbles. The valley listened, the wind carrying whispers of grief, of exhaustion, of victory soaked in loss. A Lakota elder walked slowly among the bodies, his hair silver, his shoulders stooped with the weight of years. He paused beside each fallen warrior, pressing his hand to their chest in farewell. He did not speak of triumph. He did not speak of glory. His words were only for the dead, soft as wind through reeds. You return to the ancestors. The earth knows your name. Children too young for war watched from the ridges, their eyes wide as they beheld the hilltop covered in bodies. To them it was not yet history, but a warning carved into earth and blood. They would grow with this sight etched into memory, carrying it as truth, while the outside world shaped it into story. Far away, where the telegraph wires hummed, where cities rose and newspapers clattered, this silence would never be heard. Instead, there would be headlines. There would be speeches, outrage, vengeance. The myth of Custer's last stand would be born before the dust of the battlefield had even settled. In parlors and taverns, in schools and churches, his death would be retold as sacrifice, as destiny, as the end of an era. The names of the Lakota and Cheyenne would be spoken not with reverence, but with fear and condemnation. Their victory would be called savagery, their defense twisted into defiance against progress. But here, in the silence after, the truth remained unpolished. It was not the tale of one man, but of many. It was the echo of bison hooves that no longer thundered across the plains. It was the prayer of mothers who had buried too many children. It was the cry of a people refusing to be erased. The valley would hold their story, even as the world reshaped it. Grass would grow tall again, covering the scars, but beneath the soil, the bones would whisper. On certain nights, when the wind howled across the ridges, those who listened closely might still hear the clash of voices, the thunder of hooves, the final volley fading into silence. And yet, even silence does not last forever. Already the distant tremor of boots and wagons began to move toward this place. Soldiers would come to bury the dead, to count, to reclaim, to rewrite. Officials would map the hill, mark the ground, place stones and monuments. They would inscribe history not in the language of those who fought here, but in the language of power. But for one night, just one, the silence belonged to the valley. The stars blinked awake, indifferent to the struggles of men, watching as fires smoldered low and the living held their dead. Somewhere a wolf cried into the darkness, its voice raw and eternal, answered only by the wind. In that moment, memory was not yet myth. It was only grief, and grief belongs to all who bleed. The silence after was not empty. It was heavy with meaning, with the weight of all that had been lost and all that would follow. It was the breath before history's reshaping hand. It was the pause between the last circle of fire and the first stone laid in its memory. And so the valley slept, its silence deep, its truth buried, waiting for the world to remember or to forget.